After World War II, the United States built a set of rules for the world. Trade agreements, security alliances, institutions designed to hold things together. And for 80 years, it mostly worked, in part because America, the most powerful country in the system, agreed to follow its own rules. But that's no longer really the case.
Take it seriously. Even the parts that don't seem serious, take it seriously, because the people are going to need to throw their power behind the order that they want to see.
This January, U.S. forces removed a president of Venezuela. Washington threatened to seize Greenland from Denmark, and the White House cheered on protests in Iran. In late January, we posed 3 questions to 3 scholars. How dead is the U.S.-led rules-based order? What, if anything, might replace it? And will the United States continue to act as a global enforcer or retreat to something else?
Donald Trump is not the author of the sort of downfall of the liberal international order, but he has undeniably accelerated its demise. He's basically poured kerosene over everything and then lit a match.
In the months since, the Supreme Court struck down the president's tariffs. We went to war with Iran, and Europe began the largest military buildup since the Cold War. Their answers have only sharpened, and we thought it'd be time to revisit this conversation.
Like any Jenga tower, you can take off the pillars and the structure will remain standing right up until the moment that it doesn't.
Institutions are only as strong as the practices that undergird them.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, the global order in crisis. Joining us from late January when we hosted this conversation is Professor Amitav Acharya, the UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance at American University and author of The Once and Future World Order, Professor Daniel Drezner, Academic Dean and Distinguished Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and Professor Stacey Goddard, Associate Provost at Wellesley College and author of When Might Makes Right, Rising Powers and the World Order. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020.
So welcome to the 3 of you. It really is a pleasure to have you here today with all that is going on. I hope we can make some sense of it. So Dan, I wanted to start with you. I think it's very easy for a lot of us to take for granted the fact that we grew up in this somewhat predictable international system, or maybe it just seems predictable in hindsight. I think a lot of us are looking at this uncertain world, and we're trying to put a framework around this changing system. What are we talking about when we talk about world order? And where do you rank this international liberal order that we've had since the post-World War II world order on the scale from zombie to we're just tinkering around and doing some renovations here?
Well, first of all, as an international relations professor, we should always start every conversation with some introduction to international relations theory. I'm glad we've all acknowledged that. That's a good way to start. I think in terms of we as international relations scholars talk about global order, we talk about order, we are talking about the global rules of the game, not just the ones that are written and codified, but also the sort of unspoken ones, the sort of informal ones as well. And there have been times in global history where, in fact, it has been what we would consider a Hobbesian order, where really anything goes, life can be nasty, brutish, and short. The liberal international order that you're referring to is somewhat different, beginning in the end of World War II in the Western Bloc, and then after the end of the Cold War more globally, you really did see the codifying of a whole set of rules regarding, the territorial boundaries, regarding global security, regarding international economics, trade, finance, and so forth. The liberal international order was never entirely liberal. It was never entirely international. The United States on occasion acted in a hypocritical fashion. The difference was, you could argue, in the main, the United States as the most powerful actor in the system also binded itself to the rules of the system. The rules that it created in part served its own interests, but there were times where occasionally it didn't want to comply with those rules, and every once in a while it would violate them, but most of the time it recognized there was a long-term value in adhering to the rules of the game because it incentivized others to do so as well. we have a president who's a real estate guy. The real estate term would be to say that at best, the property we are looking at, if you're talking about the liberal international order, has good bones, right? Like the general principles have some value to them. But there is so much that would need to go into rehabbing. You need to do a gut rehab. The problem is that we've seen so many contradictions build up over the last 10 to 15 years. And that has been accelerated in the last year with Donald Trump. So Elizabeth Saunders and I wrote a piece that came out in Foreign Affairs on the website yesterday that basically points out Donald Trump is not the author of the sort of downfall of the liberal international order, but he has undeniably accelerated its demise. He's basically poured kerosene over everything and then lit a match. So could you see a somehow sort of revival of the liberal international order in a post-Trump world? It's possible, but this is the second go-around with Trump, and this is the second go-around with the United States electing someone who seems quite willing to disrupt the liberal international order. Regardless of what happens over the next 3 years, it will be very interesting to see how the rest of the world reacts, even if you have a new president who says the right things when it comes to the liberal international order.
Right. Thank you for that. Amitav, turning to you, you've written a lot that the world order is this iterative global process shaped by ideas and norms over a much longer period of time that goes beyond, let's say, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So from that longer term perspective, how do you interpret this current recalibration of the world order, and what are some of the scenarios that you're envisioning?
Thanks very much. I also agree that the liberal order is not coming back, and death was predicted not by Mark Carney or highlighted, but has been, people have been saying that for at least 12 years, 15 years in 2009 world economic crisis. And now the West is just waking up to it. I also think it's not going to disappear completely. Remnants of that will remain, elements of that. They have to coexist. It won't be a hegemonic order, the only game in town. It will have to coexist with spheres of influence, Chinese organized world order, and the like. So you'll have what I call a multiplex concept. Elements like interdependence, trade, openness of seas, humanitarian values, independence of states, sovereignty. These are not necessarily Westphalian creation. These are not necessarily American creation or European creation. So that's what my book argues. I did this book, 5,000 Years of History, basically to trace backward the origins of many of these concepts we call world order, not just historically, but today. And I found that many of them emerged in multiple parts of the world in rudimentary foundational forms, admittedly imperfect, but that goes to independence of states, peace treaties, diplomacy, economic interdependence, and humanitarian value, just war principles, and also some bad things as well. But I'm not going to talk about the bad things, talk about the good things, because people think of the liberal order as something really good, which I don't agree, but let's say that. So why don't we recognize that? The reason we don't recognize this earlier foundations of world order that came from many what we call non-Western civilizations, Islam, China, India, Africa, pre-Columbian Americas, is because there's something what I call the Wright brothers syndrome here. The Wright brothers invented the aeroplane, but the aeroplane today is very different from what the Wright brothers, Wright flyer. So there are layers of prior inventions of world order that are to the contemporary world order. And that's basically the substance of my book and the answer to your question.
Fantastic. Thank you. So maybe there's a little bit of optimism that there's sort of this, human instinct to create alliances and have, some sort of order that goes beyond, just the Hobbesian alternative. So, Stacey, turning to you, together with Abraham Newman, you've developed this concept of neo-royalism. Could you briefly explain what that is and why you see that as a useful lens for understanding today's international order?
Yeah, I think it helps to understand neo-royalism. It helps to explain what it's not. The general idea was what's going to arise to take this place was the Westphalian great power competition system, right? A number of great powers, in particular the United States, Russia, and China, generally trying to increase their own power in order to protect their national security. It's all a lot of stuff that sat rather uneasily with this world. If you are in an age of enhancing national prosperity, why attack Venezuela? Why threaten Greenland? You already have a sphere of influence in Greenland. You have one very robust military base since the Cold War and the right to build an infinite amount more. So that's actually undercutting a sphere of influence. Add to this a real gleeful willingness to punish your allies, the people who are supposed to have your back in this game of great power competition. So what Abe and I think we're actually seeing is not Westphalian great power competition. It's something that we refer to neo-royalism. And the idea is that the actors in this order, they're not nation states. They're ultimately royal cliques. These are groups that are centered around somebody who sees themselves as an absolute sovereign. They can include members of the family. They can include, kind of providers of capital and support for that organization. They can include ideologues that lend legitimacy to the clique. Right. But this is really fundamentally the unit that we say Trump at least would like to see dominate. Right. And the purpose here and the process is all very different. Right. So the purpose here is not to enhance national security or enhance national wealth. It's to enhance clique security and symbolic status. So even at the expense of national security. Right. And obviously then too, the foreign policy processes aren't being done by a state. They're not being done by a bureaucracy. They're being done by this really, really small clique. And this is what we argue makes sense of this. Venezuela doesn't benefit the national interest, but it certainly does benefit this small clique. Trump has not at all been silent about this. He's going to own the money and he's going to disperse it the way he sees fit. Similarly, we see what's going on in Greenland being much more about building up symbolic and material status for a few rather than actually enhancing any form of national security status. So that's the framework, and that's how the lens sees the world a little bit differently than a Westphalian great power competition lens.
Great. Thank you. So Dan, how do you see the role that the economy is playing in shaping the world order?
The first is that one of the reasons this has been able to come about is that we've seen a sort of shifting of foreign policy responsibilities from Congress and other institutions to the executive branch, and then within the executive branch, consolidated within the presidency. These have been slow motion trends that have occurred since the post-Watergate era onward. And so part of the reason Trump is able to do what he is doing is that Congress, frankly, is out of practice when it comes to acting as a constraint on any kind of foreign policy behavior. And indeed, Congress over the last century has sort of almost had a position of we actually should not be the ones setting tariffs. So after the wake of Smoot-Hawley, for example, 100 years ago, Congress decided we should delegate a lot of these powers to the president and so forth. I think the really interesting thing of economic statecraft, the first is the degree to which the United States has decided, hey, we have a lot of advantages when it comes to things like weaponized interdependence. Global capital markets run through the United States. There are various areas, even in tech, where there are key U.S. components that are absolutely vital to global supply chains. We have an extremely large market. We can use these things to try to coerce other actors. And you've seen this from the Liberation Day tariffs onward, with, frankly, a mixed track record of success. It turns out that the U.S. is able to, by and large, coerce its allies pretty effectively. They're not going to get huge things in return for that, but they're going to get some concessions. And then when it comes to countries like China, the U.S. backed down like a scared puppy. The Trump administration was legitimately surprised by the Chinese response to the tariffs, and in the end, not only wound up cutting a deal, but cutting a deal that in many ways was more favorable to China than what, let's say, the Biden administration had done in the previous year. The question is the sort of long-term effects of this. In other words, to what extent will allies and partners of the United States still consider the United States an ally or a partner if this persists? And I think there's valid reasons to wonder about that. I think the second sort of analytical question, and I don't have a great answer to this, but it's an interesting question, is to build on the neo-royalist story, is whether or not this theory of interdependence will work. In other words, is there a royalist peace? So international relations scholars like to think about a commercial peace, right? The idea that if two countries are significantly and economically intertwined, it raises the cost to both of them if they were going to choose to go to war. So this is, liberal theories of international politics talk about all this all the time. Immanuel Kant talked about this. More recent scholars refer to it as the commercial peace. That's not what neo-royalism is, though. It's not about broad-based economic interdependence. It is literally about an elite network being intertwined. And it is possible that that elite network being intertwined could actually cause states that otherwise might be inclined to go to war to decide, you know what, it's not worth it. I'm really rich. Why do I want to risk those networks? But it is also possible that either it's not that effective a constraint, or instead of a sort of royalist peace, what you actually have is a royalist extractive cartel. And so as a result, they might not fight each other all that much, but they will be tempted to conduct lots of operations on the periphery, and in this case, the periphery includes Greenland, to try to extract as many resources as possible in order to enrich themselves. And I don't think we know how that's going to play out yet.
I'm feeling like I need to start playing Settlers of Catan again or something like that. Great. Thank you for that. Amitav, Dan brought up China. How do you see China and the BRICS more broadly operating within international institutions, within regional organizations today?
Part of the answer is obvious. China is not the one that's trying to overthrow the liberal order. The United States is. Trump is trying to overthrow the liberal order. There is China and the BRICS. China wants to keep some elements of the current order. China is not trying to overthrow the WTO. China is not withdrawing from multilateral institutions. China is the largest trading partner of the vast majority of countries in the world, and they must be getting something out of it. It's not just exploitation, which may be still there, but is still there, but it's not just that. It's not sort of the royalist, new royalist way of seeking resources. Very, very different. So in that sense, I would say try to find a sort of middle ground between the fear of China and embracing China in the way it's like a few years ago, or maybe 2 decades ago. So without bringing China into WTO will solve the problem. China will become socialized into the current international system. Just a very quick point about the royalists, because both Dan and Stacey have talked about it. And I support that idea that it's something that you want to bring into the mix. I don't think there will be any particular framing of the world order, whether it's multipolar or a royalist or it's a polycentric or bipolar. My argument is that it's a multiplex. It's all different elements will remain as part of the overall mix. So it's messy, it's complex. But on royalism, let me just tell you that royalism goes back to Sumer and Egypt. So I'm thinking of history here. And it is actually the first Eastern export to the West. So in fact, Aristotle himself thought royalism was better than democracy. A good monarchy is better than a pure democracy. That's Aristotle.
Great. Thank you. Stacey, you've touched on some of the recent foreign policy moves by Washington. Looking ahead, what kinds of developments would confirm or challenge your theory?
This is a particularly important moment, both because of the decline of liberal international institutions and because an actor that is so powerful, the United States under Trump, is the one that is actually making the case and following this impulse into the order. I think our concern right now is that the more actors and leaders take this as a mere aberration, something, this too shall pass. Let's just wait a few years and then we'll go back to normal. The more all of this gets embedded. And what are the types of things that'll get embedded? Do we really end up with a board of peace, setting up a parallel institution, allowing people to buy their way onto that institution? Let that type of stuff become established. It becomes normalized. It becomes part of the structure. And those are the types of things that can then be sustained after Trump and beyond U.S. foreign policy. It becomes really embedded in the order itself. Going back to Dan was giving these fantastic descriptions of actors, who are benefiting economically from this, right? NVIDIA basically being able to access China again, deep ties, financial ties between the United States technology companies on the one hand and the Gulf states on the other. Those don't just go away once Trump goes away.
Thank you. Okay. So the picture I'm getting is we're getting, it might just be a slight, or not slight, but a recalibration of a lot of different systems that have already existed, but we're kind of playing up some of them more at this moment. And it is going to be quite messy, I think, is the operative word.
Just to the domestic analogy, all of us are learning that institutions are only as strong as the practices that undergird them.
Thank you. I'm getting a couple of questions that ask about the role of the United States as a rogue actor, and what might constrain the United States in that sense?
I would say I was recently at a meeting of the World Affairs Council National Convention. The question became whether the U.S. is loved or feared. The United States, I have in my latest article in Foreign Policy, I call it the indispensable rogue. Madeleine Albright said U.S. is the indispensable nation. We cannot do cooperation without the United States. U.S. can be the biggest spoiler. Even if that is done, the trust will never gain the trust of the international community, including its allies. And that's what I said in the foreign policy article.
Thank you, Stacey. The neo-royalist theory appears to lead to greater chances of collusion between the global players, but how could they end up competing against each other? And could that lead to greater instability?
We've already brought this up. Look what happens to Modi in India when he refuses to recognize Trump's claim that Trump brought peace to India and Pakistan. Immediate imposition of tariffs. This is a country that the United States has been trying to woo into U.S. orbit for at least a decade because of China. And this battle over status recognition led to conflict, right? Now, this is a bit of a one-off, but then the question becomes, can you imagine broader battles that could happen over failures to recognize spheres of influence, over failures to recognize demands to extract resources, over failures to recognize who's the dominant actor in the system?
Great. We have a question, easy one. What is the future for democracies in this new era when the United States, its greatest example, is sliding under authoritarianism in a world that is increasingly dominated by strong men and security?
So I think there are two ways to answer this. There's a colleague of ours named Siva Gunitsky who wrote a great book about what happens when there's a power shift and the hegemon is of a different regime type. Gunitsky didn't talk about what would happen if there was a regime change within the most powerful country in the world. And that's what makes this so unusual, this current moment, because you've got Polity and others claiming the U.S. is no longer a consolidated democracy. If you really believe that, the U.S. is now a sort of quasi-authoritarian state, and I don't want to, I'll hedge on whether that's actually true or not in a second. But if you accept that, then yeah, the implications are pretty wide-ranging. And you've already seen that within the Trump administration. The Trump administration has evinced zero concern for human rights or democracy promotion, unless it's a state that it already doesn't like. It's ostensibly done this for Venezuela, for example, but the hypocrisy on this is just sort of massive. And so it has withdrawn USAID funding. It's made it clear that it really does not care about these things, which therefore makes it easier. And furthermore, the U.S. has shown an eagerness to cut deals with, various local warlords is an unfair term, but in some ways, like local leaders. So the fact that when the U.S. extracted Maduro, that Trump has demonstrated a real preference for dealing with Delcy Rodriguez rather than with Nobel Prize winner Maria Machado is sort of a giant red flag that actually the administration doesn't care about regime change. And in fact, will be perfectly comfortable with the status quo. The 64 Bitcoin question is this the future for the United States? And I think we still don't know that answer. There is no denying that if you look at things going on in the United States right now in terms of the Trump administration, in terms of aggrandizement of executive power, the dispatch of National Guard troops into various American cities, what's going on in Minneapolis right now, it is very easy to say the U.S. is no longer really a consolidated democracy. Even those who have made this statement have also acknowledged that the courts still matter. Congress still matters. Part of the reason that the administration has been able to do what it's wanted to is that since Republicans control majorities in both houses of Congress, they have been extremely reluctant to step up. I think the midterms are going to be a very strong signal of to what extent is the moving away from what we would consider an electoral democracy or not. If the midterms play out as most people predict, and Democrats at least gain one of the chambers, then the next question is what happens after that? How does the administration respond? To what extent do they try to thwart it? I guess my point is that if it's easy to say things have changed and they can't be reversed, but I also am old enough to remember when people were having this conversation 8 years ago and saying the same thing.
We have just a few minutes left, so I'll close with a rapid fire question for each of you. Mark Carney said, we are in the middle of a rupture, not a transition. So from each of you, is this a rupture? Is it a transition? Is it something else entirely?
So if I go first, I am a little amused by all this talk coming out of Carney And I respect him. I'm actually both a Canadian and an American citizen, so things fall apart in the U.S. and might go take refuge. Yeah. I think the general thing is that this has been happening for quite some time. And the Davos men that Huntington put it, where were they all this time? Why couldn't they see this coming? I mean, many academics have pointed this out. Of course, these academics don't get invited to Davos. So what he said is very important, but I think about 10 years too late. I think it's a transformation. If it is a rupture, it's a very significant rupture. There is no going back, except that some elements will survive, and countries like Canada have an important role. Canada going to China, signing deals is what I call wall -1. Cooperation will continue without the United States. European Union, India negotiating a free trade. European Union signed a big trade deal with Mercosur in Latin America. So those things will be happening. Let's not mourn what's gone. Let's just live with it and to make the best of it and look for new possibilities.
Dan?
I believe it was Hemingway. One character asked another, how did you go bankrupt? And he said 2 ways, slowly and then suddenly. And so to build on what Amitav said, yeah, there have been long-term sort of trends that have suggested that the order was already on its sort of last legs. But like any Jenga tower, you can take off the pillars and the structure will remain standing right up until the moment that it doesn't. And so what we're seeing is now we're in the sort of cascade moment where it does seem to be falling apart.
Stacey, final word?
I mean, agree with everything they've said about the fact that this is a long time coming. I guess what I would say is rupture, transition, how about a moment of order making and contestation? And the argument here should be, take it seriously. Even the parts that don't seem serious, take it seriously, because the people are going to need to throw their power behind the order that they want to see.
On that note, thank you all. This has been incredibly helpful, I think, in this very, for us, at least unparalleled time, and not certainly within world history if we take a longer view. I really appreciate your taking the time, sharing your insights. Amitav, Dan, Stacey, thank you so much. It was such an honor to talk with you today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.